Immediately following the German surrender, Woodrow Wilson was optimistic about the chance for a just peace. He became an enormous celebrity. He proposed democracy, a democratic, just, harmonious world free of poverty, ignorance, and war. In Europe, Poles, Lithuanians, etc., whose independence had been a dream for hundreds of years, were hopeful. Zionist Jews dreamed of a homeland. Colonial Asians and Africans hoped for independence. Woodrow Wilson broke with diplomatic tradition to attend the peace talks personally. When he arrived in Europe, he was hailed as a rock star. France called him Wilson le Juste, Wilson the Just. One Italian headline called him the Moses from across the Atlantic, and another headline in Italy called him the Savior of humanity. So you can see how he might have had a bit of a messianic complex. Let's talk about Wilson's 14 points. That's a lot, and I don't even know them point by point individually. So let's look at them as a group of kind of three buckets of points. Group one was about how nations should treat each other. It called for free trade, freedom of the seas, open diplomacy, not secret diplomacy, disarmament, and settlement through mediation, not violence. And you can see how, following World War I, these kind of goals would have made sense. Group two were centered around self-determination, basically redrawing the maps of the old Austrian, Russian, Ottoman empires. In Group 3, which really wasn't a group, but just the last point, point number 14, called for the League of Nations. 27 nations assembled at the Palace of Versailles. Here's a picture of the meeting in the Hall of Mirrors. This was the very same room in 1871 where the German Empire had been declared after the Franco-Prussian War. So although there were 27 nations, there really were the big four, France, Britain, the U.S., and Italy, although really there was just the big three. Vittorio Orlando had a dispute with Woodrow Wilson, and Italy wasn't that big a player anyway. Wilson learned quickly of very low support and enthusiasm for the 14 points. Clemenceau was reportedly said, complained, why does he need 14 points? Moses only made do with 10. And so Wilson's dream began to fall apart. Group one, things like free trade, freedom of the seas, that was largely excluded from the treaty. Group two, self-determination, got some endorsement. On the one hand, Belgium had its independence restored. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Finland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, they were all created new independent nations. Not so good for the former Ottoman territories. Turkey itself remained Ottoman, but Armenia, Mesopotamia, Syria, Palestine, the Near East were divided into trusteeships managed largely by Britain and France. And then the worst parts were Japan basically was just given Germany's Asian colonies. It's not so good for self-determination. Italy annexed 200,000 German speakers, part of the former Austrian Empire. That was the deal for their joining the Allies. And the French took over the Saar River Valley coal mines and more German speakers. Germany fared badly in the treaty. They had some northern land given to Denmark, some eastern land given to Poland and Czechoslovakia. Of course, I already mentioned some western land given to France. They were stripped of their Navy and Air Force. According to the treaty, Germany was not to have a Navy or an Air Force. Their army was to be limited to 100,000 men. And there was supposed to be a demilitarized zone in the Rhineland. That was the land between the Rhine River and the French border, the western part of Germany, to provide kind of a buffer zone for France. And worst was the war guilt clause, which said Germany was to blame for the war and would therefore have to pay reparations, money, compensation to the Allies. And the Allies said, and we're still adding that up, so we'll let you know later what the amount is. So this was not good. Apparently overthrowing Wilhelm II and becoming a democratic republic brought them no leniency. In 1921, long after the treaty was signed, an Allied commission informed them, the Germans, that the tab was $33 billion, far more than they could afford. But by then, the treaty was signed on June 28th, 1919. That's when Great Britain, France, the U.S., Germany, and others signed the Treaty of Versailles. Now, the Allies' pursuit of self-interest disillusioned liberals and socialists at home, but Wilson was pleased that the League at least had been included in the treaty. He felt it would usher in this new world order he envisioned. Its members were the signers of the treaty, except Germany was not going to be allowed in the League, and the USSR, of course, was not at the table. And so right away, the League's power would not be what it should be without these two important countries. But Woodrow Wilson believed the League would correct the wrongs of the Paris Peace Conference, that reparations would be reduced or eliminated, that disarmament would proceed under the auspices of the League, and that self-determination would ultimately be extended to non-Europeans. Article 10 of the League's charter would empower the League to punish aggressor nations. So he felt the League would make the world safer. Now, before all these wonderful things could happen, Wilson had to get the U.S. Senate to ratify the treaty per the terms of the Constitution, and Republicans had gained a majority in the Senate in 1918. There were two broad groups that opposed Woodrow Wilson. Number one was a caucus of 14 Midwesterners and Westerners. They were called the Irreconcilables. They were conservative isolationists. They thought America should retreat from the world stage. But also there were some progressives like Robert La Follette of Wisconsin. There was a guy named William Borah of Idaho, and Hiram Johnson of California. And all three of those, all of the Irreconcilables, had voted against the war in 1917 on isolationist principles. They believed the Europeans were basically incapable of decent behavior. The second group of Republicans against Wilson were very different. They were led by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, who rejected Woodrow Wilson's self-determination and the idea that every nation should have a voice in world affairs. He embraced Teddy Roosevelt's view of a few powerful nations maintaining spheres of influence and avoiding war through the careful balance of power. They didn't want the U.S. power and autonomy compromised by involvement in Woodrow Wilson's experimental New World Order. Article 10 was especially disturbing. They asked, could the League decide when the U.S. would engage militarily? Is that constitutional? Isn't that infringing on U.S. sovereignty? And you may be aware there are a few more fringe today politicians who still feel that way about the United States involvement in the UN. But that was the position of this Lodge group. Some Republicans, led by Lodge, were more interested just in humiliating Woodrow Wilson than having the debate about the treaty. They were mad about a number of things. All important Republicans had been excluded from the Paris delegation. In these 1918 midterm elections, Woodrow Wilson asked the American people to vote Democratic if they wanted to support the war. Implied the Republicans weren't as patriotic. And three, they were concerned about socialism. This wartime extension of this powerful federal government was a big concern. Teddy Roosevelt was quoted as saying, "I never thought I could hate a man as much as I hate Woodrow Wilson." Lodge was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that would oversee the debate on the treaty and did everything he could to obstruct ratification. When it finally came to the full Senate, it had 50 amendments attached to it. It still could have passed, but Woodrow Wilson refused to compromise with the Republicans, and instead pulled his old trick and took his case to the people. He made an 8,000-mile visit with 37 stops. He would spoke up to an hour at a time, up to 4 times a day. He achieved his own exhaustion. In October 1919, he suffered a serious stroke. His second wife, Edith Bowling Wilson, and his doctor isolated him from the Congress and the press for 2 months. It was a very strange situation. Many historians believe the stroke, and possibly even some mini strokes before that, had impaired his judgment that once had allowed him to manipulate Congress so well. The final vote was on March 8, 1920, and it saw ratification fail by 7 votes. Wilson served his remaining 1 year in office as an invalid, and he died shortly after leaving the presidency. And so the U.S. did not ratify the treaty, and that meant the U.S. was not a member of the League of Nations. That by itself did not result in World War II, but no world order could have succeeded without U.S. involvement.